expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chair, for being here. Thank you for staying here for all this time. I usually get to ask questions right at the end, and I appreciate your stamina really through this hearing and through a storm that none of us quite understood what was coming. And, you know, you can always look back and say, and I look at, you know, Casey Stengel or Yogi Berra said, look it up. Well, we can look it up in this monetary report, and we can see the storm. You can see where the cliffs were. You can see the drop in employment. You can see the drop in the GDP. And I think as we went through this storm, and there's still some showers to come. I mean, there's no question about that. But we came through this storm, and I just want to compliment you for being a pretty good captain, one of many, but a pretty good captain in all this. So, but I do have a few questions, and Mr. Pierce just brought up something for me. I don't know if you have your report in front of you, but charts 23 and 24. 23 is federal receipts and expenditures, 1991 through 2011. Chart 24, change in real government expenditures on consumption and investment, 2005 through 11. So when I look at 23, I see a continued reduction in revenue to the federal government, and I see in part of those spikes a huge spike at the fall of 08 and 09 as demand for federal services or services went up, gap being debt accumulated. Would that be a fair statement?
Yes.
Okay, and then in 24, as opposed to saying, you know, there hasn't been any effort to rein in expenses, if I read chart 24 correctly, there has been a reduction, at least based on this chart, in federal expenditures. Is that correct? Well, am I reading it right or wrong?
Yes, you're reading it correctly. That's really the phasing out of the stimulus in 2009, and then, of course, states and localities also have been laying off workers and cutting back spending.
All right, so let's talk about what is coming at the end of this year. Now, if our goal is to pay down the country's debt, you know, there's two ways to do it. You have more revenue and you have less expense, as opposed to what we saw in chart 23 where we had less revenue and more expense. So if I'm not mistaken, you called it a fiscal cliff. I'm not sure. I'd say that it's the Bush tax cuts expire, so revenue increases, and the sequestration or the budget cuts kick in. We can start paying down the debt. Now, you've said that that may cause a major contraction. Can you explain that?
I don't think I used those words exactly, but
okay, so I'll use your own words. I don't mean to put words in your mouth.
I'll just cite as my authority the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, has to make projections based on current law. So they assumed in their projections that the current law, the current expiration of the tax cuts and of the payroll tax relief and the sequestration all came into play on in 2013, and their economic projection based on that was for 1% growth and for unemployment to begin to rise again. And it's just the usual logic that if you cut spending sharply and raise taxes, you're going to pull demand out of the economy, and it's going to hurt the recovery. Now, again, it's very important to address these issues in the medium to long term, but if it all hits the economy at one time, it'd be very hard to adjust to that.
So, I mean, I guess what you're saying is we have these two things out there, and if we have the opportunity, both sides of the aisle, we ought to be a little more refined or targeted as we try to approach paying down the debt. At least that's how I'm understanding your answer.
You can get the same pay down, the same long-term benefits, but just a little more gradually, I think.
Okay. I have a question on page 2 of the report. It says, there's a statement, additionally, the ECB made a significant injection of euro liquidity via its first 3-year refinancing operation, and central banks agreed to reduce the price of U.S. dollar liquidity based on swap lines with the Federal Reserve. What does that mean?
So European banks are having trouble raising funds.
Right.
Most of their funding is in euros. Some of it is in dollars. On the euro side, the European Central Bank, which controls the supply of euros, has lent €1 trillion for 3 years to European banks on a collateralized basis, and that has greatly reduced the problems that European banks have in raising euro funding. The European Central Bank doesn't control dollars. The Federal Reserve controls dollars. In order to get dollars to the European banks, who use it in turn to make loans to U.S. citizens, among other things, the Federal Reserve has swapped dollars for euros. We give the European Central Bank dollars. They give us euros. On their recognizance, they take the dollars and lend them for shorter periods, not 3 years, less than 3 months, to European banks, thereby relieving them of their dollar funding problems. They pay us back with interest, and so we don't lose anything, but it helps relieve the funding tensions for European banks.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
The time of the gentleman has expired.